Welcome to the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study, hosted by Counselling and Psychological Services at RMIT University. The Counselling Armchair is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations as the traditional owners of the land. This podcast aims to help you manage your university life so you can be at your best. We'll be sharing with you tips on student life here and ways to enhance your mental well-being. Welcome back to the Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study. We're so happy you could join us. In today's episode, Melissa and I are going to have a chat about something that we talk to a lot of clients about and that statistically impacts millions of people worldwide, and that's anxiety. More specifically, we're also going to talk about the role of avoidance in perpetuating anxiety. For anyone who's ever experienced anxiety, I'm one of them as well, by the way, it's about 30% of us, so it's a pretty high figure, has probably used avoidance to cope with it because it's the most natural response to a situation that makes you anxious, right? Simply avoiding it means that the anxiety is not triggered, which sounds like a win-win strategy. But unfortunately, the bad news is that while avoidance might provide temporary relief, it often actually reinforces the anxiety, which creates a cycle that's hard to break. So the first goal to feeling less anxious is paradoxically to stop avoiding. Now, I know that must sound confusing. You mean I have to get anxious to stop feeling anxious? How does that help? Well, that's what we're going to chat about today, so stay tuned. And we thought we might tackle this one a little bit differently. We don't have a special guest with us this week, so Melissa and I are going to be your counsellors today. Both of us work with many clients who experience anxiety. And so if you grab a seat in our counselling armchair, get yourself comfortable, we hope we can guide you with some information, advice and tips on tackling anxiety avoidance. Hi, Melissa. How are you doing today?
I'm good this morning. How are you, Liz?
Yes, good. It's a Monday morning as we record, everyone. So, we're doing well to be bright and cheerful, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, chilly winter Melbourne morning. Oh, gosh.
Oh, I know. It's so true, yes. Well, I'm really looking forward to chatting to you on this topic. How common would you say anxiety is amongst the RMIT students that we provide counselling support to?
Very, very common. I would say, personally, almost all of my clients experience anxiety in some form, and probably across the service we would say maybe 25 to 30% of clients are struggling with really significant anxiety. So it is very common, and you are definitely not alone if you notice that this is your experience too. It can be really disruptive and overwhelming and just get in the way of being able to live life the way you want to. People find that it's just taking up so much of their headspace. They have all these goals and things that they want to achieve, but for whatever reason, they just can't get there. So it's definitely something that people come to us for help with, and they do experience a lot of really great progress with some counselling support.
I agree. I think anxiety is one of those things that counselling has probably the most success with, dare I say. I think it's something that's quite responsive, but as you say, it's so pervasive in so many areas of our lives that I'd be surprised if there wasn't a person on this planet that hadn't experienced anxiety at some point or another.
Absolutely. It is so, It's just a normal human emotion, right? So if you don't experience it, it's quite strange. I'd be a bit concerned.
Exactly.
So maybe we could talk a little bit more about it. What is anxiety? How would you define it, Liz? And what are the different types of anxiety?
Yeah. Well, it's like what you said before. It's like a natural emotion. I actually think that's very, very true. And I think it's helpful to think of it in that way. I like to think it's like an inbuilt safety mechanism inside all of us. It's like an early warning alarm system that tells us when there's danger so that we can act to protect ourselves. And so it's meant to be there. And I think that's quite a powerful thing to remember, is that it's meant to be there. It's just that for some of us, some of the time, the alarm is going off at inappropriate times and in an unhelpful way. And that's when we might want to intervene and sort of get some help with it or address it.
I think that's such a fantastic point, Liz.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for explaining that so well, because I think that oftentimes people just go, I'm anxious and that's bad.
Yeah.
And I just want to get rid of it because it's so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But what we actually talk to clients a lot about is that it's helpful and it's what your mind and your body is supposed to do.
Yes.
a lot of the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, because we're so sort of oriented to thinking about things as being like an illness, a disorder, and unfortunately, of course, we do know the term anxiety disorder. And so that can really kind of make us think of it as a bad thing that we have to get rid of. But yeah, I think instead it's about maybe taming it so that it's not quite so problematic is the goal.
Yes.
But, when anxiety does get unhelpful, and it does, and when it gets unhelpful, it can be pretty debilitating some of the time. So some examples of different types of anxiety that our clients might talk with us about, or that you, our listeners, may have experienced, is generalised anxiety disorder, or you may have heard it referred to as GAD, which is basically characterised by worrying a lot. I think you hear the words, what if, a lot. What if a terrible catastrophe happens and it's a disaster and I won't be able to cope? If you hear a lot of what if in your head, then you are definitely a worrier. Then we've got panic disorder. So people have heard about panic attacks, which is those moments of pure terror, extreme discomfort. You might be having difficulty breathing, your heart's pounding, you might be feeling sick. That's when you get a lot of really somatic symptoms, body symptoms, brain symptoms as well, but like all in one go, in one intense package.
And a lot of people actually think that they're having a heart attack.
Oh, yeah.
And show up to hospital, and
right.
then doctors often say, you're actually having a panic attack.
Exactly, because that's how powerful the physical symptoms are, right? Where it's like your brain just goes, I can't make sense of how I could possibly feel this bad without there being something seriously wrong with me. And then, you find that they do all the tests and they go, no, it's not actually something physical, it's anxiety.
Yes, yeah, it's powerful.
It is. Then we have phobias. So a lot of people are probably familiar with, and maybe many people do have phobias. A classic would be spiders. I'm not a fan of spiders. I would put myself in that phobia category as well. Any creepy crawlies, but it might be heights as well. It could be a bunch of different things that you might be specifically afraid of, and that's when your anxiety really activates and you might have panic attacks in the presence of that thing. Agoraphobia is another type of anxiety, which is where we feel maybe trapped or feel like we wouldn't be able to cope if things went wrong. Social anxiety disorder, of course, is another common one, and we do have another episode, a full episode on that. If you want to go back and have a listen to that one, we talk a bit more about that. But I think the defining feature of that one is worrying, being very preoccupied with worrying about what other people think of us, the fear that we might be negatively judged or evaluated by others. Then we've probably all heard of separation anxiety. We often think of that as in reference to sort of little people, our kids, but it might happen at any stage, which is that fear of being away from people that you feel safe with, family or caregivers. And then health anxiety, which is, some people have referred to it as being a hypochondriac. But, I think that's an unkind term, because I actually do think that implies that you're making it up to get attention. But actually, health anxiety is just a form of GAD, really, generalised anxiety, but just a preoccupation with your health. And a lot of the what-ifing is about what if something goes wrong with my health. And that one is, particularly perpetuated by Googling symptoms. And so it's interesting that our modern society, in a way, has really contributed to lifting that problem, reaches problem levels much more readily today because of our access to the internet and information.
Yeah. So it can be so reinforcing. And it's such a common one, really. I think a lot of people, are becoming more aware of that one.
Yeah.
I think social anxiety is often one that we come across quite a bit at RMIT.
Yes.
Because it is a social place, it's a social setting.
Yeah.
People are coming in, at this stage of life where they're meeting a lot of new people and having to be evaluated on their work and their performance. So that's a big one. But yes, I think we've come across all of these ones in our work with students. So they're all. If you notice that you're feeling any of these things, just know that there are other people who also experience it.
Absolutely. Yes, you're definitely not alone. And, anxiety can present differently for different people. It can be very unique to you. But there are some symptoms that are common in all types of anxiety. That's why we cluster them together as a group. And I guess one of them would be this feeling of overwhelming fear. What would you say, Melissa, are the more common types of anxiety that we see here at CAPS? You've mentioned some of them, but what are maybe in terms of symptoms? What are some common symptoms that people might notice?
Yeah, well, I think just going back to what you said, I think I did mention social anxiety, but I think there is a lot of study-related anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's often around a fear of failure, as I just said, being evaluated.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are two huge ones that we get at our service, because people just, feel a lot of pressure to do really well, to perform, and it can become quite debilitating. So the sorts of symptoms that people are often noticing or coming in with, so physical symptoms. So there's lots of physical symptoms of anxiety,
yes.
but these are just a few. So things like you might notice like a racing heart, a tightness in your chest, butterflies in your stomach, muscle tension and tension headaches, feeling nauseous, sweating, dizzy, and a big one that a lot of people feel is really tired. And it could be linked to the fact that they are having trouble sleeping, because anxiety can really get in the way of sleep. Another one is a restlessness, so feeling quite jittery, feeling a bit agitated, and trembling. So it's like our body is very on when we are anxious.
So true, isn't it?
Absolutely shows up in the body.
Yeah.
So other emotions, so we got emotional symptoms. So you were sort of saying feeling very overwhelmed, feeling fearful, feeling dread. You might be feeling quite irritable because of your feeling overwhelmed. So any little thing that comes in is just quite annoying or frustrating. And we often notice that people can start to feel quite down or even depressed as a consequence of ongoing anxiety. So when they're just finding that it's quite relentless, they start to feel quite down.
Yeah.
So some cognitive symptoms, so these are more like thoughts, as Liz has mentioned, excessive worrying, so thinking of those worst case scenarios, all of those what ifs. They can be really convincing when you have anxiety.
I know.
It feels like, yes, this is going to happen, even if there is really not much chance of it.
Yeah.
So another is trouble concentrating or going blank. We find it really, really hard to think when anxiety shows up, and that includes difficulty remembering things too. So you might just be really, you might be noticing I'm just a lot more forgetful than usual. I'm really trying hard to remember all this content and I just can't. I'm going over and over and I just can't remember it. And another big one is finding it hard to make decisions. So when you're anxious and trying to go through every scenario, it can be so hard to make a choice.
Of course, yes.
And just finding it so hard to figure out, what do I do now? What do I start with? What do I prioritize? Yeah, all of the decision making becomes really difficult. And when we're feeling calm, we notice, it just seems so obvious in the moment.
And afterwards you can often go back and, why didn't I think of that at the time?
Yes, why did I think of that?
So obvious. But yeah. And the going blank one, I think I've seen a lot of students who talk about this when they get into an exam, and they might have prepared, they might have done days and hours of preparation, as prepared as they could possibly be, but they sit down, they open the paper and they look at the question and they go, I can't remember. It all goes out. Boom, the brain empties, and that's terrifying. And then you get scared. Why can't I remember anything? Oh my God, I'm going to fail. And then you do more what if catastrophizing. I'm going to fail. It's going to be a disaster. I'm going to end up failing my whole course and becoming destitute and having no future.
Yes,
I mean, that's
exactly.
we laugh, but that's what your brain does. It goes to the worst possible case scenario, the worst disaster you could possibly imagine. It's practically apocalyptic in our minds.
Yes, and your brain is actually doing what it's supposed to do in a way by going blank, because if you think about when we are in a situation that we feel threatened by, the idea is that we need to just react. Yes. And so the idea is we need to turn off all this thinking and go into reacting. But the problem is that doesn't help us in situations where we need to do an exam or are giving a presentation. Going blank is not that helpful. So it is actually what it's supposed to do. It's just in the wrong situation. Yeah,
that's a really good point, Melissa. An excellent point. Yeah, I think that's good to remember.
Yeah, and so just following on from that, I think is really what we're talking about today, but the behavioural symptoms of anxiety. So I like to think of it as fight, flight, or freeze. And so the fight responses that we can often do in response is doing too much. So it might look like over preparing for things that we feel anxious about, studying hours and hours and hours each day, or rehearsing something over and over again to the point where you're exhausted. And that can look like checking, a lot of checking, double checking, triple checking. It can look like looking for reassurance from people. So that's another version of checking, like, is this all right? What do you think? Just to try and settle that anxiety. So another one is freeze. So that's when we actually just feel stuck. We cannot do anything. We feel like we just can't do an action to take us either away or towards the anxiety. And so we might actually become numb as well. We can numb out as a way of coping. And so this, I guess, is what really we're focusing on today, which is flight. And so that's when we avoid certain situations. We might isolate ourselves because we feel anxious. And another version of avoiding is procrastinating, is putting it off and delaying the anxiety. These are, I think, really helpful ways to think about how we might be responding to anxiety, is fight, flight, or freeze. So Liz, maybe you could help us understand what do we mean by anxiety and avoidance in this flight response?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's good to think about how it goes, like what the sequence of events tends to be. So basically, anxiety avoidance cycle is essentially using avoidance, not doing the thing that makes you scared, to reduce your anxiety, but then ultimately actually reinforcing that anxiety, making that anxiety stronger. So it provides temporary relief, as we mentioned. I'm anxious in the supermarket, or I'm anxious in the classroom, so I just won't go to class. And yes, I feel amazing. I don't feel anxious because I didn't go to class. This is a winning strategy. But then it actually either maintains that level of anxiety, or the anxiety actually gets worse. So it's harder and harder to get to class, harder and harder to go to the supermarket, or wherever it is that you find yourself avoiding. Basically, the way it works is this. First of all, you experience a trigger situation, which might be, well, if it was a spider, for example, that might be the trigger, or it might be, like we mentioned, going to class, or could even be a thought. What if I do something bad? What if I forget? That might be the trigger. Then you feel anxious, because that's generally how it works. It's like the alarm's being triggered. We feel the anxiety. We then avoid that trigger. It might be the place, the situation, the activity. And then, yes, we feel less anxious. So that's like a reward. It reinforces, like if you ever have anything to do with training, say, a dog to do things, how do you reinforce the dog's behaviour? You give it a treat every time it does what you want it to do. And then it goes, I'll do that more because I want that treat. In a way, it's this same sort of thing. Like every time you avoid a situation, you feel less anxious. You are reinforcing that anxiety. You're saying, yes, you should feel anxious about this. It is terrifying. It is unbearable. So that's really how the cycle works. And then, those long-term consequences are that you never actually get to learn that what you're scared of is maybe not as fearful as you think it is. So that's one of the long-term consequences. You continue to fear the situation, or as I mentioned, you might feel more anxious. It gets bigger. And then it sort of spreads. There's a bit of a contagion effect. It's no longer just the supermarket. It's no longer just the classroom. It becomes the university campus. It becomes the suburb that the university's in. It's like you need to avoid more and more, in a way, to feel less anxiety. But your life becomes more and more restricted because of that. So that's basically it. You miss out on opportunities and experiences. You might even become quite isolated. So that's basically it in a nutshell, the anxiety avoidance cycle. In a way, it's like avoidance is a bit of a Trojan horse. We think it's actually the solution, but it actually becomes part of the problem. And what have you noticed, Melissa, about some of the ways that we avoid, or that students avoid? I say we because I think we all do it, really.
We all do it.
Yeah.
Everybody does it. Yep. Yes. Well, the most obvious form of avoidance is, of course, just staying away from the situation. Like you said, not going to class, not going to that party, and then avoiding tasks that make you anxious, which I think students would really relate to. So that assignment is coming up, I'm not sure what to do, it's a lot of pressure, I might just put that off. And then another is maybe even showing up or going to something that you find anxiety provoking, but then leaving early. So it's like, I'll dip my toe in, but I won't go in completely. And so, other ways that we avoid is, like you said, maybe trying to avoid thoughts. So trying to stop yourself from thinking about what you feel anxious about, because that's going to just cause a lot of discomfort. And we can often do that by distracting ourselves, playing video games, scrolling on social media, binging Netflix, doing anything that will just kind of occupy our thoughts so they don't go there.
Yes.
One thing that a lot of people say is, but why do the thoughts come up before I go to sleep?
Yes.
Because you're not doing anything, because you're not distracted anymore, and suddenly all the thoughts come back.
Yeah. And then you can't sleep.
So they're always there. And then you can't sleep.
Yeah.
Another way we avoid is by numbing. So that could be through alcohol or drugs, actually, altering your state of mind. Another is eating. It's like another form of distraction, but it is also a comfort. Shopping or using sex. So all of these things that would just sort of alter our state of mind, help us stay away from that experience of anxiety. Yeah. So another really subtle one, which a lot of us use, I would say all of us to some extent, is using safety behaviours. So this is when you do show up to an anxiety-provoking situation, but you use subtle things to cope. So this could be like arriving late, bringing your phone and looking very preoccupied with your phone, like you're busy, not making eye contact with people, having an exit plan for, I can leave early for this reason, or I just got to duck out, I've got work. Or making sure that you've got someone else with you, so they become a bit of like a security blanket. All of these things, like you mentioned, do help us in the moment, but don't help us in the long term to reduce or have a sense that we by ourselves can cope with that anxiety.
Yeah, such a good point. And I think those subtle ones are ones we may not recognise as being potentially problematic.
No. Because you're like, I'm still there.
Yeah, I did it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some people think, well, whatever helps me get there, which is true.
Yes.
But it shouldn't be the goal.
Yes. If you want to sort of ultimately get improvement over time, then it's about sort of actually letting go of those safety behaviours and those safety people and being able to just you yourself be present in that moment. We're going to talk about how to get there, because it's not necessarily about dropping yourself in it. But we were talking about anxiety around study, and certainly our RMIT students will be very familiar with anxiety around study. What would you summarise as being the ways that anxiety can impact study? There's a lot, isn't there?
Oh my gosh, so many.
Yeah.
So many ways. So we have things like we've just talked about. So it could be avoiding class due to social anxiety, which then snowballs and become more difficult to face, which then means that students miss out on really important content and often fall behind on things. And they also miss out on important friendships and social experiences as well. Another is exam or assessment anxiety, which is when you feel really, really anxious about being evaluated, and that can really interfere with your ability to do well or even take exams or do assessments. So a similar one in that is around performance anxiety and doing presentations. So that's sort of like social anxiety with assessment anxiety in one.
Double whammy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that can be really, really difficult because people, we naturally as humans have this fear of being judged or excluded or rejected. It is really understandable. Another way that people are impacted is they often can feel anxious about speaking up in class. Because they worry, like, what if someone thinks I asked a really dumb question and they judge me?
Absolutely.
And so that's a big one.
That's a huge one. I actually I had that one. Sorry to interrupt, Melissa, but it's just put me in mind. It's a flashback to my uni days. I really had that one at uni. And
Same.
I'm not a socially anxious person, generally speaking, but when it came to speaking up in class, I never did. I was terrified that I was going to ask a dumb question. What you said really resonated for me. I was like, oh, my God, that was me all over. I would just stay quiet. And then sometimes I'd go up to the teacher at the end of the class and I'd ask my questions kind of thing, because it's like one-on-one I could handle it, but in front of everybody else. Yeah, I reckon that's a super common one.
It's huge. Like, I know so many students like, I'll just email them afterwards, or I'll chat to them afterwards, so I don't have to do it in front of everybody. And oftentimes when I was sitting in class, I was like, is someone going to ask this question? Can someone ask it instead of me?
Me too. Just hoping someone would do it instead. Oh my God. I used to find myself writing it on my page, like the words, almost like a script.
Oh,
but I still,
like to practice?
To practice. I still didn't do it though. I still didn't do it. Oh.
Yeah, no, it's so common. If you feel like you're the only one there, you are not.
You are definitely not.
90% of the class is feeling the same way.
Yeah, exactly.
So another way that anxiety can really impact study is actually perfectionism, and people don't realize that this is a form of anxiety, but this idea that it has to be really, really good, or the flip side, I cannot make a mistake or I can't fail, it means that people can really struggle to firstly do the work, so they procrastinate a lot, but they also really struggle to hand things in to the point where they might hand in late, lose marks, or not hand in at all. So we'll actually do another episode on perfectionism. It'll be our next one. So we won't go into it too much here, but please keep an eye out if you notice that this impacts you.
Yeah, that'll be a good one for people to tune into. We're excited about that next episode on perfectionism because it is such a pervasive problem in our student group.
Yes, it is huge. So something we haven't touched on yet is how our thoughts tend to feed anxiety. Liz, what are some of the styles of thinking that can really trigger anxiety?
Yeah, and I think this is a really good thing to cover because you can start to just observe yourself a little bit. Like after you've listened to this episode, just notice how often you do these forms of thinking. I think there's 4 styles that are particularly problematic. We've mentioned one already, and I'm going to call that the worrier. The worrier says, what if? All the time. What if this happens? What if that happens? And what is at the end of the what if is always a disaster, catastrophe, something unbearable. Like no one ever goes, what if it turns out really well? What if I have an amazing time? No one ever does that, even though those things are also possible, yet we tune into the disastrous, catastrophic things. So that's one of the very present things with anxiety thinking. Another one is our inner critic. Again, we all have one of those. It's that voice that says everything that you're doing wrong. It's that catalogue of flaws, all the things that you are not up to par with, which really undermines your confidence. I'm no good at public speaking. I'm terrible at expressing myself. I'm not a good writer. I'm no good at exams. All those sort of negative thoughts is going to feed your anxiety. It's going to feed this idea that you can't cope with these situations that you're afraid of. We've mentioned the perfectionist, and we are going to go into detail, obviously, in our next episode, but it's worth noting that one of the phrases that the perfectionist, our inner perfectionist, uses is I should. I should, I must. If you hear the should and must in your thoughts, it's probably your perfectionist having a go. So that's a really characteristic wording. And then the last one is like a sort of a hopeless, pessimistic voice that tends to contribute to our anxiety. And that's the sort of part of us that goes, what's the point? It's never going to be any better. I can't do it. I can't fix it. It's beyond me. That's obviously also going to really contribute to our anxiety in telling us we can't cope, we can't fix it, we can't do it. So I'd say those are the 4 key thinking styles. There's lots of others, we could go into sort of, which we won't because we don't have 5 hours, but we could go into, all the different, what we call cognitive distortions and thinking styles that tend to contribute to anxiety. But I think those 4 are a nice, neat place to sort of start, just to tune in a little bit with yourself and go, am I doing these? Am I hearing myself say this? Speak to myself in this way, because that's probably contributing to my anxiety.
That is such a good point. I love that last one as well, because I don't think that that's often associated with anxiety, the hopelessness and sort of pessimism, but I think that that's a huge one for the avoidance.
Yes.
Because then we sort of talk ourselves out of doing the thing that we're anxious about, because we sort of go, what's the point? It's not going to go well anyway.
Exactly. Why bother?
Yeah. So one of the more kind of useful quotes about anxiety, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard, is feel the fear and do it anyway, which is easier said than done, by the way.
Yes. Much easier said than done.
But, how does doing the things you feel anxious about help?
Yeah, so that term was it was the title of a book by this person called Susan Jeffers, if anyone wants to look it up. I think it was, written even in the 70s and 80s, so it's been around for a while. But I actually use that phrase a lot with my clients. I remind them of this idea of feel the fear and do it anyway. And really what I think is behind that quote is that you can actually still walk and talk and do even if you're feeling frightened. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So it's really what we're saying is this idea of do the things that make you feel anxious. You realise that actually it wasn't catastrophic. I can think of an example of someone I worked with once who was really afraid of going to class. And when she finally went to class, it was great. She actually really enjoyed it. She made a friend and that became a lasting friendship, so it actually wasn't the catastrophe that she'd been imagining. Sometimes when you're actually brave enough to try and do the thing that you're afraid of, it's good. It's not a disaster. And that's so powerful when that happens. It helps us to rewire our brain's response to fear. It tells us we can cope. The situation is manageable. And that is what then reduces the fear. So that's basically how it works. That's how feeling the fear and doing it anyway is a helpful thing to do. And if we want to get technical about it, the sort of psychological term for this, what we're talking about here, is called desensitization. And doing the thing that you're afraid of is called exposure. So if you're wanting to get into the jargon a little bit, you might hear those words, desensitization and exposure. But, doing that process is really powerful and is the way that people reduce their anxiety over time. People with specific phobias, for example, like the spider one, can go from like being so terrified that they're having massive panic attacks even at a picture of a spider on a postage stamp to being able to hold a spider in their hand.
That's incredible.
It is incredible. It is really incredible. It's good to remember that it is, that's something that can actually happen over time. I think the other part of it is that you build confidence in yourself. I can do it. Instead of I can't do it, I can do it. It's hard, but I can do it. It's uncomfortable, but I can do it. I think that's an important learning.
I think that's a huge one. And I love the way that you framed that, because it's not supposed to be, oh, I did it and it was amazing.
Yes. Exactly.
Because I think that's often what people think the alternative is, and it's not.
No.
It's like, yes, it was hard, or that it maybe didn't go perfectly, but it was okay. Yeah, I managed.
And that's probably the perfectionist in a way that expects it to go amazingly well. No, it doesn't need to. It can be just average, just good enough. It's still a good experience to help with your anxiety. Yeah, exposure also means that you break that avoidance cycle that we talked about before. You get to collect some evidence that what you fear is actually not true. And I think that's very powerful in the future. So when your anxiety comes up again, what if I break down and cry when I have to give a presentation? You can go, well, last week when I gave that presentation, I didn't break down and cry. So there actually is a chance that that's not going to happen, or it's actually unlikely to happen. Evidence is really powerful, reminding ourselves of evidence of past successes of situations that we're fearful of really builds our confidence. It's also like, imagine the sense of relief, right? I talk with students a lot about this of like, yes, doing that exam is going to be terrifying. Yes, you're going to be anxious. You're going to be tired. You're going to be worried, all of those things. How good is it going to feel afterwards? It's going to feel amazing. Just that. And sometimes I actually get clients to visualize that feeling. I can still, it's been, 25 years more maybe since I finished uni. And I can still picture and imagine the sense of relief when you walk out of the exam room and you've done it. That feeling, oh my God, if you could bottle it.
Freedom.
It's so good. It's so good. So it's like, that's your incentive. That's your kind of positive reward at the end of it, of how good it feels when you actually did do it. I think, though, it's worth saying that doing exposure and trying to get desensitized to the things that you're frightened of is hard to do, and it can be hard to do it on your own. And you don't have to, I know we did talk before about safety behaviours of getting someone to go with you to things as, maybe a way of doing avoidance. But I think that it's also worth saying that having someone help you with the process of doing exposure, like a counsellor, it might be a friend or a partner as well, or a parent even, is a way of being able to do exposure more comfortably. You don't have to go the hardest way as your first step. You can ease into it, and you can do it with support. So, for example, if you've been avoiding class, then maybe one of the things would be that you contact the teacher and say, I've become really anxious about going to class. I'm going to come on Tuesday. I just want you to know if I'm looking a little bit nervous and I'm sitting up the back, that's why. And then you sort of get to dispel those fears of what are they going to think of me for turning up and I haven't been, for 3 weeks without an explanation. So that's gone now. They know because you told them.
Yes. And people are so afraid of just sharing what they feel anxious about. They're anxious about sharing their anxiety.
I know. And yet, how powerful is it when you share your anxiety? Because almost all of us have had the experience, I dare say everyone has had the experience where they share something that they're anxious about. The other person goes, oh my God, yes. Or if it's not exactly the same, it's like, oh my God, yes, I don't get it for that, but I get it for this. That's how universal this experience is. Because of what we said earlier, it is a built-in safety mechanism within us that protects us.
Yes.
That's why it's so universal. So do share. Sharing it actually creates a great sense of relief and actually normalises it as well.
That's right. And, obviously my hope is that teachers will be very supportive. They're there to support you. They want you to turn up to class.
Absolutely.
And so if you just share a little bit of what you're experiencing, they will actually appreciate that quite a lot.
100%. That has been my experience over the years. Like when students have communicated with their teachers are like, great, thanks for telling me. Now I know. I just thought you weren't showing up to class because you didn't care. I'd much rather that you weren't showing up to class because you were really anxious and now you're trying to work on the problem. How can I support you? Yeah.
100%. Yeah.
I think so. So let's talk a bit more about exposure, particularly if after hearing us talk about feeling the fear and doing it anyway, our listeners are thinking, okay, I'm going to give it a go. How would you advise people to work on doing exposure sort of effectively and safely?
Yes, so it is firstly very scary. I just want to validate that.
Yes, 100%.
It is very scary to do this. So it's about going at your speed with the right support. And so in general, we would say that firstly, maybe develop a list of what aspect of your fear is most anxiety provoking down to what is least anxiety provoking. So this is what we call a hierarchy. And the idea is to sort of start at the bottom. Start with what you feel least anxious about. Not so it's such a breeze, because then it's not really challenging. It's still got to have a bit of a challenge to it. But start with that. And so, for example, if you experience social anxiety, you might really worry about giving a speech the most. And so that's 10 out of 10 anxiety for you. But perhaps something like just smiling at a person you don't know is more like a 3 out of 10. And so that's something you can give a go. And realize, they didn't smile back, or they did smile back and it was fine. World didn't end. So it's about just slowly building up to the things that you feel really anxious about. The next step could be something like, I say hi to someone in class and I start a conversation and ask about their weekend. That's low stakes. Don't have to go be their best friend. Just say hi, how you going? And so we can just slowly build up to then maybe giving a speech in front of the class and doing a presentation. So starting really slow and gradual, and then practicing. Practice.
Yeah. Not just one time.
No,
Not just one time.
don't expect it.
I'm never going to do that again. No,
never. That's not how it works. We need to do things over and over again to start to feel a sense of like that confidence that, okay, I've done this before, it's gone okay. Or I did that last time, didn't go that well, but I think if I do it differently this time, so we learn, So ideally, if you can practice something even several times a week, the more you can practice it, the better. Another great step is to try and stay in the situation until you feel less anxious. So oftentimes we bail out early because we're like, this is too much. I'm so anxious. I'm going to go. But if you can just start to try and stay a bit longer until you notice, this is actually getting a little bit easier. I'm just noticing my anxiety is coming down. And ways that you can do that is to use some strategies like deep breathing, or lots of different breathing exercises really, but anything that kind of starts to calm down your nervous system so that you can start to feel like, I'm noticing some anxiety, but it's there, it's manageable. I can just take a few deep breaths. It could be focusing, if we're using like a social situation, like focusing on the other person, just trying to stay really present in that conversation. Just going, I'm going to kind of get out of my head a little bit and be here, right here. Just try and make this connection with this person. Yeah.
Be mindful, in the moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not in your
be
head.
Mindful. Yeah. So another is if you can try and just monitor how you're going. So you might notice that, okay, last week I did that. I was really anxious, but this week I did that and it was a little bit better. My anxiety went from, a 7 to a 6.
Yeah.
That is an improvement. That is progress. And so really try to focus on that, because I think oftentimes we tend to disregard it and go, but I'm still anxious.
Yes. Yes, good point. It's if you can see that it's dropping down, we go, actually, yeah, it's a 6, not a 7. That is progress. And tell your perfectionist to button up and just be quiet for a moment, because that is progress. It's not about getting to 0. You may never get to 0. Like, it might always be a 3 or a 4 out of 10 when you have to give a speech. I think I'm still like that. I didn't have unbearable anxiety in giving presentations, but it was pretty strong. Like, I remember the first talk I ever gave when I started working at RMIT, my ankle was shaking, like literally shaking. And all I could think was, everyone can see that. Everyone can see that. Everyone can see that. Oh my God, what will they think of me? And, so that doesn't happen anymore. Like, I can feel quite calm, but I wouldn't say I love giving presentations. I wouldn't say, yes, I'm going to do that all the time.
Sign me up tomorrow.
Sign me up to become the public speaker every day. You know what I mean? So there's still like probably a 2 or a 3 level of anxiety, but that's not problematic. That's enough that I can still do it, and it's fine.
That's right. So I think it's sort of like, have faith in the process.
Yes.
That the more you do it, the less anxious you will feel.
Yes.
It may not ever completely go away.
Yes.
But at least you will feel like, I can do it.
I can do it now.
I don't have to love it.
Yeah, that's right. I don't have to love it. Yeah, I love that phrase, have faith in the process. I really love that. That's such a great thing to remind yourself of. We talk about this stuff with clients because we know it works, because we have a lot of evidence. There's a lot of studies. There's so many clients that have gone before you that have used these approaches successfully. So have faith in the process. I love that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think all of these things, and maybe as a great tie-in with that, I love the idea of being really self-compassionate.
Yes.
Because you are doing such a hard thing, and you are really challenging yourself, doing something outside of your comfort zone. So this is a time to be really gentle on yourself and to really be kind and go, oh, this is hard. This is really hard. I can give myself that grace that, maybe I'm going to stuff it up, and that's okay.
Yeah, maybe my ankle is going to shake, but that's okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And people might see I'm nervous, and look, it's human to be nervous. We're not perfect in every situation. So the fact that you're giving it a go is the most important thing.
It's huge. Yeah, and rather than, because what we tend to do, it's that inner critic, is to focus in on devaluing ourselves, like, oh, see how bad that was, your ankle was shaking, your voice quavered, your face went red, and it's, would we say that to someone we love? Would we say that to a friend? We wouldn't go, it was all right, but, your voice was a bit quivery, and I noticed your ankle was shaking and you went a bit red. No, we wouldn't, because we know that would make them feel worse. We would go, you did amazing. That was so good. Well done for giving it a go. And so you just to apply that same way of speaking to yourself is a really good thing to do.
Yes, and to be honest, for a lot of us, that requires practice too.
It does. Doesn't come naturally.
No. So, all of this stuff takes time. And another thing to remember is that if you find that with, you're trying to do all this exposure, you're really trying to progress with this, but you might find like, oh, this is just so overwhelming. It's okay to pull back. Go back a step. Don't see it as, I'm just bad at this, I can't do it. But you can go back and go, okay, let's step back to that 3 out of 10 anxiety thing that I was able to do, and just keep doing that for a while.
Yes.
Or maybe it means that you need more support. But we can, there are just ways that we can work with this. Yeah, exactly. So don't give up on it, because it is hard. Yeah,
you don't have to go at it like a bull in a china shop. You can actually go, I'm just going to take baby steps. And if one step is too far, then I go back and I consolidate that previous step, and I just until I feel really comfortable before I try that one again. It's okay to do it, like that. Still works.
Yep. Still works, exactly.
Yeah, so we can certainly work on challenging those negative thoughts. Like I said, like we've just been talking about, being more self-compassionate, stepping back from the thoughts, rather than engaging with them. Another thing that we often work with clients on is to get them to connect with their values, like what's important to them. And our listeners might be going, what's that got to do with anything?
What's a value?
What's a value? So how would you mind explaining, Melissa, like what is the value? What is the value? What is the value of a value? But how might clarifying and connecting to your values actually help to reduce your anxiety?
Yeah, I think that's a great one. So it is so important because it really helps us have a sense of direction and a sense of why. Why am I doing this?
Yes.
You know, why is this important to me? Why am I putting myself through hell
yes.
to do this? And it's about, okay, what's important to me? So it could be my values are I want to really connect with people, or I really want to make sure that I fulfill my potential and have this range of beautiful experiences where I learn so much about myself, I learn about other people. It's a very kind of expansive view of our experience. It's like I want to be open rather than closed, because anxiety, like you said, makes our world really small.
Yeah.
It really restricts us. So if you can connect to your why, then that can really help when you are experiencing those really anxious moments. It's like, this is really important to me. So some of the things that you might ask yourself is, what sort of person do I want to be in this situation? You know, how do I want to show up here? What are the kind of strengths and qualities do I want to cultivate or grow? And what do I want to stand for? So a lot of people who feel anxious, a big one might be courage.
Yes.
That feel the fear and do it anyway.
Yeah.
Because courage is not about doing things that you don't feel afraid of. It's about doing things you are afraid of.
Oh my gosh, that is so true. Yet so many people really do think of it as courage of being like, I walk in there with no fear. That's not courage.
I'm confident. Yeah.
If there was no fear, then it's not courageous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think that's such a misunderstanding of the word courage and bravery.
Yeah. So it's like, I can do scary things. I can do hard things.
Yes. And I feel scared doing them, but I do them anyway.
Yes, that's courage. And so, and you know, another way to look at it is, how do I want to behave? Yeah, so how do I want to show up in this situation? Maybe I want to be really kind. Maybe I want to be really, open.
Yeah.
Maybe I want to be honest. You know, it's so many different qualities that you can embody. So another way to understand your values is, you know, what kind of activities or work really give you meaning? So you might... because I think it can be really hard to identify what our values are. We could just kind of go, I want to be a good person. I want to be kind of nice. Get along with people. But it's like, what is it that is really fulfilling you? What is that, like, gives you that spark or that sense of like, oh, this is so important, or this makes me feel really connected in the world?
Yes.
So I think these are very, very deep questions.
They are.
But I'm sure that lots of people can at least come up with a few things that they go, this is really important to me. This is why it's important for me to work on this anxiety, because I don't want it to hold me back. Yeah,
exactly. No, I really love that. And they are deep questions, and it's maybe something that you continually do. Like, maybe we're never finished with understanding our values. They may change over time. And I often think of a value as being sort of a guiding principle rather than a goal.
Yeah.
So, like,
yes, it's not a goal.
No.
It's not something you ever tick off.
No, that's right. You know, so for me, like, an example might be like, one of my values is definitely family. And what family might mean for me is being a good parent, for example, and that's a value. So that's not something I ever finish. Goal is something you finish, done, put that away. I keep creating new goals that go with that guiding principle. So sometimes people think of values as, okay, I set this goal, and goals are connected to values, but they're sort of, but it's like, the value is the guiding principle, the goal is the
actions,
action towards it. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. No, I think that's a really good point. So maybe we could also talk about another really important concept in anxiety, which is acceptance. How does that help with anxiety?
I agree. I think this is the key concept in anxiety recovery. It's a really important part of healing. And I think the main thing is to remember that when we fight against anxiety, when you go, I hate the fact that I have anxiety, why am I like this? You're expending so much emotional energy and distress on going, why is this happening? Why do I feel this way? Why can't I do this stuff? think of it as like a nice metaphor is like you're playing tug of war. Like there's one person holding the rope at one end and you're holding the rope at the other. And it's why, and you go back this way and then, why can't I? And why is it like this? And there's no answer to that question ultimately. And so you get caught up in the distress of the fact that you have anxiety. And that is actually what causes most harm to you, is being upset that you have anxiety. So, in a tug of war, if we can't gain strength over the other side, our only other option is to let go of the rope. Let go of the rope. So say to yourself, anxiety is a part of me. It's a normal part of the human experience. And I hope that's come through in our episode today and what we've been talking about, Melissa, because I think it's such a key message. It's meant to be there. You're not going to make anxiety go away, because then there'd be something wrong with you if you didn't have anxiety. We just want to get anxiety to the point where it's having less interference in our life, where it's not, the alarm's not going off when we don't want it to go off, but we're not going to get rid of it. Maybe we actually want to work on sort of working with anxiety. So that's how accepting anxiety allows us to think of it differently. Let's work with it, okay? This is what happens. These are my symptoms. How do I work with them? Rather than like, I hate it, I don't want it, I just want it to go away. That sort of prevents us from actually engaging with it. And there's actually a really lovely book I'd like to recommend by a cartoonist called Bev Aisbert. And she calls the book, there's a series of them, but it's like, I think Living with It is the first one. It, capital I, capital T. And it is anxiety, and she draws it as this monster, this little dragon. And she talks about like training it, teaching it to go for walks, like, obedience training this. And it's really plays with this idea around acceptance and working with anxiety, but it's presented in this really whimsical, kind of humorous, gentle way. And anyone that I've ever recommended that book to has really gotten a lot out of it. They really relate to it, and they find it's really a nice way to engage with the idea of anxiety. So I'd like to put a little plug in for that. And she actually has a website that you can look at as well. But I really like that idea.
We'll put it in our We'll put it in our show notes.
Yeah, we will, yes. And so just even thinking of it as, okay, it's like a little monster, or I sometimes think of it as like a puppy. It hasn't been trained yet. It's barking all the time and it's weeing on the carpet. But, we can get it to actually sort of, sit quietly, wee outside and do more of what we want it to do. So, but we've just got to kind of train it. And to do that, we have to accept that it's going to be in our life. We're going to have this puppy, this monster. It's going to be there. We have to work with it.
I love those metaphors or analogies. Yeah. I don't know which one is which, but
my gosh, I know.
That's fantastic.
I know. Look, I love my metaphors. And people may have noticed that about me, because I think it's a really helpful way to connect with an idea.
Yes.
So, yeah, and, like, not to end the metaphors, there's always more from me, but it's like, I also think of it as anxiety when it gets to the problem level of being like a car alarm. And everyone's had those cars in the street, right, where the car alarm goes off when someone just brushes up against the car, or like a leaf falls on it. You're like, oh my God, that damn alarm's going off again. Sort of our anxiety is a bit like that. So we want to work on it becoming a bit less sensitive to triggers. So yeah, it's just working with it, acknowledging that we have that alarm, it has been triggered, but maybe I don't need to do anything in that moment. Like, my alarm's being triggered, I just have to wait. It will pass.
Yeah.
Like, here's another metaphor or an analogy. The weather. The weather never stays the same. If you wait long enough, it'll change. And
That's
I think
it doesn't last forever.
No. And no one has ever been in a state of perpetual panic that never ever stops. It can feel like it's never going to stop, but actually it does. It does pass. And just even that statement, this will pass, is a really nice thing to say to yourself when you're having a lot of heightened anxiety.
Yeah.
I also think acceptance really contributes to the idea of self-compassion, as we mentioned earlier, because it's like, then I'm not blaming myself for something being wrong with me and me being defective. I'm just saying, this is part of me. It's meant to be part of me. It's become a little bit problematic at the moment, but I'm working on it. I know I've got my why. I know why I'm doing it, and I've got my kind of idea and the things that I need to do to sort of reduce the avoidance. And that's just me, and that's okay. It's okay to be human. It's okay. That's normal.
Yeah, that's beautiful. No, I love that. I think that's a huge part of it, the acceptance and the self-compassion, because we often just want to get away from it.
Yeah.
And then the avoidance happens, and it just again becomes reinforcing. So if we can just try something different, try changing our relationship with this just a bit, and just see what happens.
And of course you want to avoid it. Feels awful, it really does. I've had panic attacks, I experience anxiety. Believe me when I say I know it feels dreadful when it's in full flight. It really does. Of course it's incredibly uncomfortable, but it does pass and you do feel better again. So I think I'd like to just even say, just on a sort of personal level, not just as a psychologist, but that's an approach that has worked really well for me, is to accept it and to not see it as a flaw, but to just see it as part of who I am and something that I need to work with from time to time.
I think that's a fantastic place to end. I love that. That's just a great summary. Thank you, Liz, and thank you for listening to today's episode of The Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Your Wellbeing and Study. We hope we've been able to shine a light on the relationship between anxiety and avoidance, and how our efforts to evade our fears can inadvertently fuel them. Working on developing awareness of how you think and how you tend to avoid is a really good place to start. Maybe after today's episode, you'll notice how often you say, I should, or what if, how often you consider the worst case scenario instead of the best case scenario, and how you try to get away from anxiety. We hope you can begin to accept that anxiety is part of being human, and reducing avoidance can mean it's not so debilitating and overwhelming. And please do reach out for help if you need support with anxiety. You don't have to do it alone, and therapy can be really effective. You can see a counsellor at RMIT, or speak to your GP about a referral to a psychologist in the community. We'll pop some links in the show notes to help you along your way. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe to our podcast and share it with anyone who might benefit from these insights. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a review. Until next time, take care and be kind to yourself.
Thanks for joining us today on The Counselling Armchair, Nurturing Wellbeing and Study. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and learned a useful thing or two. Have a great week, and just remember that life can be amazing. See you next time.
Isn't life so amazing? Sometimes it can get crazy, but hey, that's okay. We've got another day to make mistakes and say sorry. There's no sense in our worry, 'cause all we can do is try our best to make it through with love.